Hello, I'm Natalie Claudia from EUMEPLAT. I will briefly introduce the second panel, this first panel, representation in the European media, research results from the project. So, as I already mentioned, we have many presentations from the partners of the project online, and we have Ioanna here with us in Rome. So I will first give the floor to Paco to present the methodology and the results from Spain. Thank you, Paco.
Hello, can you hear me?
Very well.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, and I'm so sorry that I couldn't be there. Let me share my screen. One sec. Okay.
Can you put it on full screen? Great.
Yeah. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Look, I will not present, sorry about that, the Spanish case, but the full exercise on the social media, because in our case, it was a little bit different, the approach, okay? So we will present the exercise we conducted on the analysis of social media, okay? Just very quick, let me start by saying that it's super interesting what's going on. I mean, I remember 15 years ago, 10 years ago, we were in a position where we were saying that social media will bring democracy, the Arab Spring, so many movements. Kind of the narrative was this will free us from many things, including the power that the traditional media they have in society. Okay, we are 15 years ahead or now, and it's quite the opposite. So now social media is destroying democracy. We are claiming that we need again a strong traditional media in place. So the same that we were blaming 15 years ago, it's kind of a shift, okay? And as Andrea was saying, migration it was one of the, or it is one of the topics where we can see that despite migrants having or not having the voice on the media, okay? So I'm gonna present very briefly the exercise we did, hoping that it can trigger some discussions afterwards, okay? So what we basically did is we tried together with all the partners to capture what was the representation of the topic migration in 10 European countries, okay? Trying to see what is the concept that, or how Europeanization or the concept of Europe together with migration, it is represented in social media, in this case, Twitter and Facebook, okay? And we focus on the concept of migration and gender. I will focus here on migration, and we will try to see whether there was difference or not within countries. So within each country where Europe is mentioned, whether the representation of migration was different, and between countries, whether Europe is mentioned or not in social media, and whether or not there were countries. So we were trying to conduct a kind of an analysis within countries and between countries. Okay, basically at the time when it was called Twitter, we were able to download a social media post about this topic. We built, and here it's an important thing, a framework for representations. We all talk about Europe and what does it mean, but then we need to understand how this is, let's say, represented in the narratives. And together with all the partners, we did a semantic mapping of what Europe could mean in order to be able to search for these quotes unquote keywords in social media in order to download the post or the tweets. Okay. Then we did a tremendous effort, and I want to acknowledge that again, and thanks all the partners to manually code this data to reflect whether this this semantic map that we built together was or not was represented in the specific content than we download. Then we did a machine learning algorithm in order to code all the posts, because we did not analyze 100, 200, or 1,000, but many more. And then we analyzed the data quantitatively. This was the methodological pipeline that we have used. Oops, let me just go here. The topics, okay, how we transform the concept of Europe, okay, what Europe means, okay. So we obviously in the content downloaded, we use the word Europe and all the synonyms, but also words like values, people, law, culture, institutions, interaction, dialogue, territory, and the sentiment. So Europe means specific values, specific people, specific laws, quotes unquote, a specific culture, institutions, and all these concepts, okay? And then we downloaded these numbers of posts, okay? So we are not talking as in each of the countries. Those were the content downloaded and analyzed, okay? Some of the results, very quick, because we don't have much time. So I don't know if you can see the graph, okay? But you have the countries in the bottom: Belgium, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Germany, Spain, all the countries participating in the study, and the concept, how Europe is represented, whether it was Europe as the concept of institutional, Europe as the concept of laws, values, people, and territory. And then we have the when migration is mentioned, okay, with the concepts related with migration is mentioned. So then we have the different dots represent the content, and the countries and the percentage of posts. One example, in Germany, for example, institutions, it was most migration. So when they talk about Europe in social media, migration, they are talking mostly, or 60% of them, about institution, or about values, 30% of the post, or about the territory, or about the people. And we did this exercise for all these countries. We were able, so you see how migration is represented in social media in these dots, okay? We can summarize these just by saying that the debates differ across Europe. So there is no common debate in Europe, but in each country, this debate is materialized through different concepts when we talk about migration, okay? When we go about Europe, we found, let's say, in the same exercise, the dots represent the concepts related to the Europeanization, okay, the countries, and then the estimates, okay, below or above the, let's say, the average, okay? And we found similarities in the European versus non-European debates across Europe. So what does it mean? That when we talk about migration, adding or not adding the concept of Europe, we found several similarities, okay, in the debate. So somehow Europe is represented across the different member states analyzed plus Turkey, bringing let's say some content to the analysis or to the debate, okay. We also analyze whether or not media, so the Twitter accounts were run by traditional media, how there were differences between those and, let's say, individuals, single individuals, and single individuals and the media outlets, so to speak. And here we found, again, if we see the average and the different dots, some similarities in the difference between media and non-media across Europe, okay? So it seems that across Europe, when we talk, or the representation of migration, it has some similarities, whether or not the quotes unquote the messenger was media or was media accounts or non-media accounts, especially when we talk about the territory and values, meaning somehow that there is a clear interrelationship between mainstream outlets and what individuals talk across Europe, okay? The sentiment, we also analyze the sentiments towards migration, towards the concept in Europe versus non-Europe posts, so posts that were related or non to Europe, and media versus non-media posts, okay? We found similarities in less neutral sentiments in European discussions and more polarized in the case of Europe versus non-Europe posts. And in the case of media, similarities in more negative sentiments from media, okay? So when we talk about migration in media, it seems that across countries, they use the same type of sentiments, where when we talk about Europe and no Europe, less neutral sentiments are shared across the different countries, okay? In between countries effect, so meaning what they are talking within, the analysis conducted within each of the countries, we found difference of representations of Europe and non-Europe. So when we talk about migrants within each country, there are differences in the narrative, whether the Europe concept was included or not. This means that when we refer to migration or the representation of migration in the media, it's somehow affected obviously by the national context and not that much also about the European context, no? And we see the debates, and Italy, it's a clear example of these debates, okay? When we put migration and Europe, again, it's very difficult to identify a pattern. And this is some of the discussions we had with the colleagues from other countries, how we can interpret this in our country, how we can find cultural or political explanations to these online media representations. And we we have identified some patterns, but still, we're still discussing how this can be interpreted in terms of national/European dimension, okay? Good. Yes. We also try to explain whether there were some of these representations could be, let's say, triggered or driven by income inequalities within each country. Okay, so if we see the countries that we have identified, we see that there are income difference between them, and we try to see whether the narrative somehow represented in those countries was linked to the income inequalities using the Gini coefficient, okay? And we saw that the lower coefficient were identified in those countries with more income equality, okay? Meaning that somehow, if to what extent, I would say, the European concept, the European values are, if we identify them as a more, let's say, income equality than other values like quotes unquote US, or we see that the European value may play a role in the way the migration is represented when we talk about Europe. The same goes for territory, people, and values. So there is some relationship there on the way we represent migration in the national countries linked to the income inequalities measured by Gini coefficient. Okay. Good. Between countries, when we try to compare the countries, okay, and what is the representation of migration and the media, we also identify difference among the countries. Okay, so we couldn't identify a clear pattern in each of the countries, but there are difference in the way media and non-media affect the representation of migration. The same whether Europe or not Europe was represented or taken into account. Just a brief summary. We have identified certain similarities when we talk about Europe and in sentiments across Europe when we talk about migration. Okay, there are certain similarities. However, there is also heterogeneity, and we were not able to clearly identify European discourse within the narrative, within the analysis conducted within countries and without countries. When there were similarities, it was always around values. So maybe when we talk about migration within these countries, we approach this not in terms of the territory, when we talk about Europe, not in terms of the laws, not in terms of the people, but values. So it seems that there is a common space for values interpretation in the way the Europeans and the countries represented there approach migration when we just talk, or when we talk about values, not with the other let's say categories that may represent Europe. Thank you very much, and thanks again to the organizers of this meeting, and to all the partners that very actively collaborate in collecting all this information and analyzing all this information. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Francisco. So now we go ahead with the partners who have done this wonderful job. I will give the floor first to Justine. Justine Thomas from New Bulgarian University. Hello, Justine.
Hello, thank you, Natalie. I hope you hear me. Nice to see you. And thank you also, Paco, for the interesting data that you presented for the whole project. Now I will show and share. I hope you see my screen now. I will share the document, the results for Bulgaria. From Paco's presentation, you already understood about the methodology. And also I want to add the same feeling that 15 years ago we had the understanding that social media will make a better thing for the society, but really nowadays I doubt about it. So let us see the data for Bulgaria. Bulgaria is a country which traditionally has a lot of migration, both from everywhere to everywhere. However, in the last few years, people are a little bit of course, getting more conservative and not with good, we do not have good legislation, and we do not really support in a European way the migrants. And all these processes continue, especially with the war in Ukraine. We had a huge wave of migrants from Ukraine, but our research goes a little bit back into time before this period. So what we have as result, some of the results you already saw on the previous presentation, but together with the countries for Bulgaria, what we can see is that the migrants topic is mainly represented by the topic of law and culture, and which is very sad. People's perspective is not at all on focus. We had really, this was really amazing discovery from this research, and me personally, I'm very sad with this result, but that's how it is. The people's stories and voice is not heard at all, or almost at all. So here is also the evolution over time. Again, what we can see that law and culture are the most the topics that are most of the time on the top. So if we go to the perspective Europe, not Europe, it's interesting to see this difference again, mainly on the WoW and culture topics that on when we talk about culture, we have non-Europe, and when we talk about WoW, we have mainly Europe, which is also very curious. Also, when we talk about values, non-Europe is much more represented, which is the big discrepancies between Europe, and these big discrepancies are very interesting, I think, and the WoW is dominant, as you may see, for the European perspective. I come with a few examples. Of course, I have in mind you do not read Bulgarian, but this is independent media. It's Europe, Bulgaria, Bulgarian. An example.
Justine, we are not hearing you.
I don't know.
Very well.
My internet is unstable, maybe.
Now we hear you. So you can go ahead. Yes.
Sorry. Yeah.
No, I was joking.
So the second example comes with. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know if you hear me. I hope you hear me. This is the second example with Bulgarian who mainly his publications are very popular, and this is he has kind of a Facebook blog on the topic. What was the big finding from this research was the fact that on the Bulgarian Facebook and Twitter there are a lot of fake profiles and fake media profiles that go with a lot of propaganda, which is really a big finding for us. And these profiles are not very popular always, but they distribute disinformation every single day. So we have also the institutions that talk about the topic, of course, as Ministry of Internal Affairs of Bulgaria on Twitter. And main dimensions for Bulgaria are the same as for the Europe. They are spoken about. Representation of immigration is about people, not person. But also some more conclusions. The topic of migration is not very popular on Bulgarian media and on the social media channels. It is mainly the debate goes when there is a problem and not with something nice to share. A lot of fake profiles just distribute fake information through copy-paste. And statistics, mainly politicians from the right wing use the migrants topic in their political communication. This is from the EUMEPLAT project, World Package 4 results, and thank you for your attention. Sorry for the bad internet connection.
Thank you, Justine. We managed. Thank you so much. So we will move to Germany. Volker, can you hear us? Hello, Volker.
Hello, can you hear me?
Not very well.
I'm using my headphone microphone.
We hear you very good.
Now, yes.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me, if only digitally. I'm pleased to be with you today. Natalie, can you please put up my presentation?
Yes.
Thank you.
Do you see it? No?
Nope.
We are managing two screens in the rooms. We're getting a bit confused from time to time where the presentation is now.
Oh,
Okay.
Do you see it
ah,
now?
very good. Yes. Can you put it up full screen, please?
Is it now full screen?
That's the presenter's version. Well, in any case, so yes, please, the first slide. So the research period at the end of 2021 in Germany was determined by two events. The escalating situation at the border between Belarus and Poland, which was important for all of Europe, as Paco has mentioned already, and Justine as well. And the other important event at that time were the national elections on 26th of September 2021. And looking at the relevant posts, we see quite a spectrum of positions towards migration. On the one hand, we see a continuation of the welcoming culture, which was most notably expressed by Chancellor Merkel when in her famous statement, "We can do this. We have managed so many other problems, so we can manage this one as well." That was a statement from 2015. And this continues, so there is a lot of solidarity. Nope, please back. Yes, thank you. But there is also at the other end of the spectrum a lot of xenophobia. And this takes all sorts of forms of a diffuse kind of being overrun by migrants to a very elaborate narrative called the Great Replacement. So the idea here is there is an alleged conspiracy of elites who want to replace the native population, so the Germans in Germany, with Muslim migrants. And this is sort of a quote from one of the posts. This is an illegally imported army of foreigners, and they have very different reproduction rates. That was an interesting finding. When we looked at the markers for gender in the migration data set, we found quite some overlap. So there is, in fact, a weaponization of sexual reproduction in the migration discourse as well. There were several events, particularly in New Year's in 2015, 2016 in Cologne. There was a big New Year's party with a lot of foreigners, groups of young male foreigners encircling women and sexually harassing them, that created a big outcry in Germany. So this linkage of migration and gender was one of the interesting finds. Then concerning the German national elections, all parties in fact avoided the subject of migration, whereas the far-right party AfD used every single migration-related piece of news to fuel fear and anger. Looking at posts with a European scope, we saw that the sub-dimensions were primarily law, territory, and institutions. Paco mentioned this already, that Europe is particularly viewed as an institution, an organization of institutions. And in fact, the issue of migration is expected to find its solution at the European level. I will come back to that on my last slide. Looking at posts with a non-European scope, so with a local or national scope, here the dominant subtopics are people, values, and culture. And here we find stories of people, so actually migrants speaking in their own voice, the very few we found, and we find stories of successful integration. And this happens on the local level, of course, and in the area of culture. An interesting finding in which you might expect if you think about it, but it was still striking to see that in the data. Democratic voices regularly will refer to values. Values of fundamental rights and freedoms, obviously the right to asylum. That's a very important point of reference for democratic voices. Looking at posts from the far right, we see that they do not explicitly talk about values at all. They, not even general ones like fairness or justice. Instead, the right defend their interests, and they are very clear about what they do not like and who to blame for it. So here we see narratives of Germany first, which is a collective egotism, other forms of group egotism, and then, of course, an individual level of egotism that we see in these posts. Next slide, please. Going to best practices, one quite interesting example we found in our posts was the Council of Migration, Rat für Migration, which is a nationwide organization founded in 1998, when there was already a perceived crisis of racism in Germany connected to migration. And this is a group of academics from various disciplines who do research on migration and integration issues. And they are involved in lawmaking. They give advice to lawmakers, write opinions, other publications. They have an annual conference, and they do various projects, including media service integration, Mediendienstintegration, which is a service particularly for journalists and media who want to get background information. This is the slide we see on the right. So with the three elements, they give background information. Then in the middle, we see numbers, facts and figures, and then news. They also make connections to experts for interviews in the media and other kinds of advice. This group, the Council for Migration, also in 2018 has established the European Network for Knowledge Sharing on Migration. So while this started among academics in Germany, this has expanded to a European network for knowledge sharing already. Next slide, please. Since Andrea has mentioned that a big problem in Europe concerning migration is that the migrants are being talked about, but they do not speak in their own voice. And here's an example of a magazine that was founded in 2009 by migrants in Germany, focusing originally primarily on issues of migration, now sort of shifting towards widening the scope of issues, also talking about the causes of migration, and they invite migrant journalists to join Magazine, and also beginning journalists are being trained by Magazine, who then also move on to other media or into politics. So this is also a place where we see a lot of successful examples of integration and becoming politically active in Germany by migrants. Next slide, please. Our research period is 2 years back. So looking at what happened since then, we can see that Belarus was the main issue then. It has all but disappeared from the media since then. But in fact, the situation in Belarus is unchanged, with again, a lot of migrants still trying to cross the border to Poland. On the European level, we've seen the expectation that Europe finds solutions for the migration problem. And indeed, the new pact on migration and asylum is a centerpiece that was announced in September 2020 by the then new Commission von der Leyen. And that has been worked on. It's a complex piece of legislation with 5 separate legal acts that has been negotiated throughout and is coming into its final phase right now. Then Justine has mentioned this. So on the 24th of February 2022, so right after our research period, Russia invaded Ukraine, and the Temporary Protection Directive that was passed in 2001 was activated, allowing 4 million Ukrainian refugees to find temporary shelter in the European Union. And on the German level, in what observers have called a major U-turn, Germany has tightened its asylum laws to speed up procedures and deportations, to deter asylum seekers, and this is probably the most important reason for this political act, to take the wind out of the sails of right-wing radicals who obviously mobilize on issues concerning migration. Final slide, please. I'm not going into any recommendations and to any details, but just an idea that I would like to put into our discussion. I think what is needed here is a general reframing of the debate from a constellation of us versus them to a we are all in this together. So the idea, for example, of Sunak to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda is not only illegal, but it also doesn't make sense if we think that we only have one planet and we are all in this together and we all have to find a common solution. And I think very important from our findings from the German data set is to focus on values over interests. And I look forward to our discussion and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Volker, for the last recommendation and the message that you have all together in this. So I give the floor to Ioanna, who's here. So Ioanna, mic.
Hello, I'm Ioanna Archontaki, and I would like to present on behalf of the National University of Athens team our findings for immigration representations for Greece. Is it?
To you.
Yes, it has my name on it. Is this okay?
Ioanna,
Yes.
can you speak directly into the microphone? I think it would be
Yes,
easier
we
for us to
just
hear.
trying to fix the presentation. Okay. Okay. So before presenting the findings, I would like to talk a little bit about a couple of important landmarks regarding migration in Greek recent history. First of all, in 2015, during the summer, more than 800,000 people crossed Greek maritime and land borders, only to end up being trapped in camps around the country. The refusal of several EU countries to lend assistance exacerbated the problem and added pressures to migrants in a social setting of a struggling economy, undocumented work, and social exclusion. Then a second important landmark was in 2019, the Evros border crisis. Evros is a river that divides, is a physical border between Turkey and Greece. And in 2019, President Erdogan encouraged migrants to just cross from Turkey to Greece. The Greek government responding by deploying the police, the army, and local militia against people that were unarmed and totally despaired. The government narrative was promoted by the Greek media, blamed migrants for overburdening the state institutions, and painted any opposition voice, like from politicians, activists, even citizens, as misguided, like victims of Turkish propaganda or outright treasoners. As a result, several issues that came up to the public discourse that time were under the pretext of migrant invasion. Now, in the beginning of 2015, the Greek media started to cover the crisis as they have always done since the 90s, like a social problem that, coupled with unemployment and criminality, needed an immediate state response. Gradually, the narrative changed to positive and like in a humanitarian sense, as long as the European Union followed the policy of open borders. But the moment neighboring countries started to close their borders and raise fences, the narrative changed again back to negative, racist, and xenophobic. Afuxenidis and his team noted, however, that the Greek media were already covering migration as a matter of national security even from 2014, like 1 year before the crisis. Now, when it comes to migration in European representations, we don't have a lot of studies for social media. However, we did have a lot of press coverage. Now, in 2015, there was a research on Greek and Cypriot newspapers that showed that the dominant representations of Europe were totally negative. The reason was like migration is often hidden under a much more polarizing issue, that is Euroscepticism. In the best case scenario, Europe is shown as fragmented, but mostly as a perpetrator of the migration crisis through its policies, and to a lesser extent, blamed for inhumanity. Kalfeli and other research, a Greek researcher, showed two different periods for migration. The one from 2011 to 2014, migration was covered as a domestic problem. But from 2015 and on, it is covered as a wider European crisis. I also included research from Perifanos and Woutsos that they developed a multimodal hate speech algorithm for social media, and the striking finding was that the algorithm recognized tweets as toxic only because they were referring words such as Islam or refugees. Now, in our analysis, the Greek case was based on more than 18,000 cases from social media. The most prominent topic was also for Greece, the Poland-Belarus border crisis, but also the illegal pushbacks of migrants and refugees performed by the Greek authorities. Yes. In general, we can say that the Greek opposition parties, NGOs, and citizens are demanding from the Greek government and EU institutions to just respect the international treaties and provide refugees with shelter and decent living conditions. On the other hand of the political spectrum, there are posts referring to national security and endangered ethnic values by the inability of the Greek government to block immigration. Now here we see that the peak in migration representations took part during the month of November. Like in November 2021, the crisis in the Poland-Belarus borders were at its peak. And that was a very important incident also for Greek media because it resembled a lot the Greek-Turkish border crisis of 2019. Now, in both cases, migrants were seen as a threat and their effort to enter the European Union a matter of national security. The most popular dimensions regarding migration were territory, values and institutions, and the least talked about were law and to a much lesser degree people. From logic regressions analysis, we confirmed that territory and institutional representations were likely to occur when the posts were talking about Europe, and low people and values were observed in non-Europe related posts. Territory had the largest coefficient estimate for Europe, and values had the smallest in the Greek case, and also that applies to the media. Regarding the most popular posts, the most popular was one of the Greek Prime Minister presenting a new camp in Samos Island. The Prime Minister said that we are making good on our commitment to finally close the same food structure and inaugurate a new one that is modern, secure, with control entry and exit points, and among others that the government has made it good on its political commitment to secure and justly guard the country's borders. Now, media affiliated to the government also put the emphasis on positive statements held by EU officials and political leaders, praising Greece for its effort to guard European borders. Here is a post from Sky, that's a broadcast TV channel, quoting the Kurz, the Austrian Chancellor, praising Greece and saying that today these phenomena are better dealt with. The approach is different than it was in 2015, when Greece, with European taxpayers' money, was pushing migrants to other European countries. I also included another example, the third most influential post during the period. That is an incident between the Greek Prime Minister and a Dutch journalist that caused a wide discussion on social media about the pushbacks, which up to that point was only reported by the opposition media. Now, this post is from Press Project, an alternative news website, and the post says that Kyriakos Mitsotakis, Greek Prime Minister, reacted in a particular strong way when the Dutch journalist Ingeborg Becker asked him, "When will you stop lying about pushbacks and about what is happening in Greece?" Visibly concerned, the Prime Minister replied, "I know that in your country you can ask direct questions, but I don't allow you to insult me in this building." While he suggested that yes, we block the flows from Turkey and we call on the Coast Guard to return them back. Now wrapping up, media representations of migration, of course, tend to focus on controversy and conflict. And they also disregard the socioeconomic reasons behind migration. Even in cases of positive coverage, the undertone of cultural assimilation is ever present, treating migrants as the proverbial good apples. In its core, media representations regarding migration rest on a variety of processes. On the one hand, media come to reinforce the current social stratification, turning stereotypes and selection biases as a common sense. On the other hand, they conceal and typecast the diversity of migrants, representing them as a sole entity. Added to that, the migrants themselves, during they face a variety of barriers and are unable to resist the narrative. In our sample, discussions about migration in the Greek online sphere predominantly revolve around tragedy and loss of life. Now, these incidents are reduced to mere statistics and receive limited coverage. In some rare cases, depending on the magnitude or a specific significance, it may be explored. However, human deaths, solely as numbers, reflect the perceived worth of migrants' life and raise questions about the timing when it's deemed significant and when it's not. In accordance with the existing theory, the best practices in our sample show that there are a few journalists who prioritize the quality and fairness of their reporting, and they do go beyond political agendas. They seek input from migrants and NGOs that they perceive as reliable sources. But accessing alternative sources, of course, can be challenging. Migrants may lack trust in journalists, and on the other hand, journalists may face difficulties in establishing connections. However, this is the general rule of thumb to go, to engage directly with those people involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. Very insightful, and we will discuss about that in the second and third panel. Next from Portugal, Sofia and Antonio.
Hi. I was trying to share the screen, but it says that I cannot share while the other participants are sharing. So I think you have to stop your sharing.
Or you can interrupt it, no problem.
I tried, it was not being possible. Okay, let's see. Okay. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so we are going to talk about the study case of Portugal. And to start off, we wanted to do a small introduction to the migration in Portugal in general. So most of our migrant population is from Brazil in Portugal right now, but we still have also immigrants from many other countries, like United Kingdom, Cape Verde, Italy, India, Romania, Ukraine, and among others. And this is before the Ukrainian war, but since the Ukrainian war, because we have even before that, we already had so many Ukrainian immigrants, we are starting to have more and more. So we have to take into consideration that our data is before the war. Otherwise, I'm sure that more cases regarding Ukrainian immigrants would appear. In total, around 5% of our population residing in Portugal is migrant. And regarding a time context, as we can see, we have much more immigration than emigration. So even like in the axis of the graph, we can see that. And most of our peak in emigration was during the financial crisis. So a lot of young people, and not so young, went out of the country because of the unemployment rate. But that has decreased significantly. And regarding migration, we have having ongoing increase in immigration, with the exception of the COVID period, so in 2020. Regarding the discussion of migration in media in general, what the literature tells us is that the traditional media overemphasizes the us and neglects a bit the others. And this is focused especially in the way that we are reporting based on what we as country need to do, for instance, to receive better the migrants, and not so much about how they feel or their stories or their voices. The refugees are often seen as a homogeneous group, and even in media they are always referred as migrants and not sometimes as refugees, which contributes to a public misunderstanding of the situation they have. So as it's a choice that they came, or like they came to Portugal for political gain, and not to avoid a war scenario or any other crisis in their own countries. In social media in particular, what the state of art showed us was that a lot of comments about anti-immigration are based on economic or safety or cultural reasons. As I was mentioning, this can be also tied up with the sense that when we talk about migration, we put refugees also in the mix and not not separated. And although this is happening in social media, it's considered that overall in Portugal that's the exception, not the rule. So overall, Portugal is considered an open country with a good policy to receive people from other countries, especially refugees. And during the refugees crisis, Portugal was perceived by media overall as a welcoming country. In the context of the study, so between September and November of 2021, Portugal was welcoming a substantial number of refugees from the Middle East and North Africa, as I assume many countries in Europe were as well. We had a bit of issues with our border and immigration service that is called SEF, that had some controversies that were in the front of the discussion regarding immigration. One example was the death of a Ukrainian migrant in the airport that after an investigation were considered 3 SEF agents as culpable for his death. And the process was ongoing since 2020 until mid-2023. So it also, during the context of our discussion and analysis, this was an ongoing process, but with a lot of media attention, and also some political discussions regarding the golden visa for people with a lot of money that buy properties, real estate in Portugal above a certain value, that has special conditions and are welcoming the country, and also special visa and tax conditions for highly qualified immigration. So there was a bit of public and political discussion on these topics, special starting in 2020, but also, and this is more, so you know, especially now with the housing crisis in Portugal, this has become a more and more aggravated situation in our political discussion. To finish off, regarding study context, in September 21, there were a lot of news regarding the work exploitation of illegal immigrants in Alentejo, that is a bit of south in Portugal, where there was discovered that several individuals were not being paid a fixed salary, were living in very bad living conditions, and working a lot of hours per day. So this was considered like modern slavery, and was very much on the news. In October, the leader of the far-righty party, Chega, was forced to apologize to a family because he has referred to them earlier that year as bandits. So this was also a very big news, this public apology. And finally, in November, one of our main broadcasters had to air a story about the trials and tribulations of illegal immigrants. And as you can see here, they are not called refugees, they are called illegal immigrants, although they are refugees, focused on a group of Moroccans and other people crossing the Mediterranean Sea to arrive in Portugal. Antonio.
Well, hello everybody. I hope you are doing well. I will now present to you the main results and also the best practices for the Portuguese report. So first things first, territory was overall the most frequent representation with more than 25% of observations. Values and law represent about 20% of observations. Institutions and people between 10 and 20%. And lastly, culture less than 5%. So moving on to the next slide, we can see that we had 2 main spikes in representations, with the first one happening in week 39. Now, we believe that the spike in week 39 is mainly related to news that the European Commission was looking for international partnerships to control irregular immigration. And within the national context, as Sofia said, we had a lot of news about the Border and Immigration Service that contribute to these representations, to this spike. Now, the spike in week 45, as was previously said, is mainly related to the conflict in the border between Poland and Belarus. And we saw a lot of posts about episodes of violence in the border, the conditions of migrants, the EU's response, so hence this spike. And it's really interesting because if you look at these graphs, we understand that law and values are throughout the research period usually the most frequent representations, but in week 45 we see that there's an exponential rise in territory, mostly because there was a gigantic amount of posts talking about people being stuck in the border and wanting to come into the European Union. So now moving on to the next slide, we have comparisons between Europe and not Europe. And so first, there were statistically significant differences in the proportions of all representations, except for territory. And when you think about it, it makes sense because we had, once again, this disproportional amount of posts that appeared in the Europe data set about the conflict in the border between Poland and Belarus. Next, we have posts about Europe have a higher percentage of law, values, institutions, and culture. In values, we believe this is mainly related to the fact that there were slightly more posts that talked about values within the European context instead of strictly, the national context. Institutions and law, we actually saw a big overlap within the Europe data set. So I remember specifically there were a lot of posts about the European Parliament, starting a European agency especially dedicated to asylum seeking. Lastly, posts not about Europe have a higher percentage of the people's social media representation. And as we said in the context part of the presentation, a lot of the people that came into Portugal, a lot of refugees, they did not transit throughout Europe. They came directly to Portugal. And so their recollection of events is mostly framed within the national context or even the international context, but not really the European one. So before we actually move on from this slide, I just want to point out that as you can see, for values and culture, for example, even though the results are statistically significant, the difference in proportions is actually very small. And now as we move to the next slide, we see that, for example, okay, so territory is much more likely to be found in Europe, obviously. But for example, values and culture is actually more likely to be found in not Europe posts. Once again, it was a very small proportion difference in posts, and also the territory representation kind of drowns out the rest of the Europe posts. Lastly, there was no statistically significant differences in law, institutions, non-neutral sentiments, or the number of representations. So moving on now to media and not media, we see that once again, there are statistically significant differences in all representations except for law. And now this is the really interesting part that I think it's most interesting, is that non-media has a higher percentage of people, values, institutions, and culture representations. And as Fia was saying in the context section, the Portuguese media has this tradition of representing migration or migration stories in a very impersonal, very in-group style of reporting that is much concerned in just stating facts, And on the other hand, we have non-media organizations that have that talk about the issue in a more opinionated way, a more personalized way, hence this higher number of these representations. And once again, media has a higher percentage of the territory representation, because I was thinking, if we think back about the conflict in the border between Poland and Belarus, once again, there was a lot of posts. And what the media basically did is that the posts would be very short, and they would say, well, there is a conflict and there's people in the border, and that would be it. Hence the highest frequency of this representation. So moving on to the next slide, we have this graph that we actually chose not really show for Europe because it was not as relevant, but here is extremely relevant because as we see, there is a higher percentage of media posts with 0 or 1 representations and a higher percentage of non-media posts with 2 or more social media representations. So once again, it's this idea that the media is presenting things very factually, focusing on just one thing at a time, very short posts, while on the other hand, non-media organizations are interlinking ideas and opinions, and thus leading to posts that are usually a bit longer and talk about many things at the same time, and so more social media representations. And so here we just have the coefficient estimates for media, and they just basically verify what we said before. So it's not really, we don't really need to stay on the slide for too long. So we can just move on to the best practices. And here in best practices, we mainly focused on things that we saw in our data set. So things that were present in posts. And so taking in consideration everything we said during the context and everything now in the results, we believe that stories focused on migrants, and on their personal experiences are very important to bring awareness to the conditions these people often deal with. And so here we actually chose to highlight some posts by the Portuguese International Amnesty, where they offer a very detailed account of the conditions of migrants in the border and what was happening. So we found those posts to be very important. But besides posts that just talk about migrants and just explain these things, it's very important that migrants have a chance to offer and share their own experiences, to show us the world through their eyes and what's actually happening. So their vision, their voice of events. And here we highlight a post that we found. It was called by an outlet called Plataforma Media, and they told the story of 3 Iraqi boys stuck in the border between Poland and Belarus, but it also offered them the chance to speak by, including a lot of direct quotes and letting them share with us their events, their vision of events the way they happen. So lastly, we talk a little bit here about institutions because we believe they have a fundamental role on online and on social media to, you know, share a lot of content, but also publicize and advertise a lot of different events. And here we mentioned the Portuguese High Commissioner for Migration, and they have a Facebook page in which they share a lot of things. And one of those things was the Forum for Immigration, Integration, and Interculturality that was actually happening throughout our research period. And so we saw a lot of posts related to that. And so in the next slide, we just have, you know, just basic pictures of the posts and you know, we have a poster for that forum. But yeah, this is pretty much it for best practices. I pass the word now back to Sofia for the conclusions.
Okay, so three main conclusions from Portugal. Sorry, the first one is the territory's most frequent social media representation, and especially as we saw was regarding the conflict in the border between Poland and Belarus. So we had the spike of social media posts in one of the weeks that we analyzed that completely overshadowed many other representations. Then we have the people as the only social media representation that exists in higher proportion in posts about not Europe. As Antonio was saying, this can be related with the refugees and the posts about them, so with more of their perspective and their experience. And then finally, values and people, institutions and cultural in social media representations appear in higher proportion than in not media. Appearing in higher proportion in not media, as Antonio was saying, our media posts, and this is something that I noticed that is very typical of Portugal. Our media as a style of reporting that is very unique to our country, that is very on the state. It's just stating the facts, very on the point, very neutral, not polarized at all, not politicized. So when we are reporting, as you can see, this kind of media representations as value or people, culture, would not be part of a factual media post. That is the case in Portuguese media. So that's the presentation from our side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sofia. Thank you, Antonio. So we will close with Lutz for the Turkish results. Lutz, we are not hearing you.
So can you see the full screen of my presentation?
Yes, and we can also hear you.
Okay, fine. Yeah, first of all, thank you very much, Natalie, for inviting me to this, to present at least some topics about the results from Turkey. As Andreas already mentioned, Turkey is a little bit special since it is not a member of the European Union, but has, of course, very much in common on the one hand side with Europe, and has, of course, an extremely big role, important role, especially in the context of migration. First of all, also some statistics from the time when we gathered the data. By 2021, around 3.7 refugees came to Turkey from the Syrian Arabic Republic, followed by Iraq, round about 150,000 refugees, and Afghanistan with a number of 140,000 immigrants. So it means that it has a very big impact for Europe, because they, of course, the aim was not to stay in Turkey. The most of them wanted to go via Turkey to Europe, and therefore the support of the refugees is based on the contract between the European Union and Turkey, which who stayed in Turkey. This is based on the so-called refugee deal or refugee pact from the 18th March of 2016, and the aim was to achieve a halt or at least a reduction of the movement of refugees via Turkey to the EU. And in fact, it means in the Turkish case, the problem was on the agenda, especially in two contexts. First of all, in the context of dealing with the migration problems, and on the other side, in the context of the most immediate internal problems of the country. And before we started our analysis, there were already academic research on the topic of migrations in the context of platformization. For example, according to Danish, the emergence of technological tools made social life in developed countries more visible, namely the increasing use of social media platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and it contributed to the causes of increased visibility of migration in masses or mass media. So the platform have attracted, on the other side, the immigrants to have similar lifestyles, especially in terms of social freedom and purchasing power. And another publication from Keating and Jamaat stated that negative perception about immigrants usually emerged when opinions such as immigrants pose an economic and cultural threat are spread in the target country. So our main findings was that the coded post seems to refer to the issue of immigration mainly from the national perspective, from the national and institutional perspective, and the general narrative revolves around the need of actions, regulations, controls, and sufficient response toward the immigrant groups. Rather than referring to legal issues and official interaction with European countries regarding the issue of immigration, social media conversations expresses concerns about the immediate condition of immigrants in Turkey. And this tendency explains a little bit the high level of representation by values as the primary dimension mentioned in Not Europe and Not Media posts. So user-generated posts and Not Europe posts addresses the problem of values in order to refer to problems such as integration, freedom, social life with refugees and so on. Interesting is that the analysis of both datasets, Not Media and Not Europe, mentioned legal issues as the least employed dimensions. So therefore, the issue of immigration can be seen as the analysis dealt with largely in the absence of legal interventions, but with a strong emphasis on institutional and value-based actions. And here, the comparison of the two statistics, what we found, so we see, especially in the Europe and the media post, a very strong representation of Europe by institutions, while in the Not Europe and Not Media, especially the representation by values is quite dominant. Now I would like to give you some qualitative findings which we regard as quite significant. especially in the institutional level, the statements which belonged to President Erdogan, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at that time, Mevlüt Çavuşoğlu, and the Minister of Internal Affairs, Süleyman Soylu, are often directed to European institutions calling for immediate action of official answers for the problem caused by the flow of Syrian immigrants. And interesting is also when we have a look at, on the dimension people, 38 posts were about illegal refugees in Turkey and the deportation of refugees in Turkey. And we also had a little bit a look on the post. Especially interesting was the media posts were not, which we evaluated, had were posts which were not that much commented or replied or whatever. So in fact, most of the posts did not initiated any discourses or something like that. There was only one post which was extremely highly discussed and commented, and this was, yeah, we can call it maybe the banana gate. So in fact, the background was in the classical media, in TV, there was were interviews of the Turkish citizens, and they complained, especially near Hatay, there was someone who said he was not able to buy bananas anymore because the refugees bought all these bananas. And at that moment, there was a group of migrants which posted, especially TikTok posts, eating bananas, which went extremely fast viral. And this was taken by the classical medias, where they wrote posts like Habertürk here, 8 migrants were detained on the allegation of eating bananas for provocation. They were sent to Provincial Directorate of Migration Management for deportation. And interestingly, the most of the posts reflect the behavior of the refugees in the critical way. This is very significant, and only some of them commented on the decision of the Provincial Directorate critically against freedom of expression or whatever. So this is something what we found quite interesting, especially since this was a kind of topic which was discussed and which opened somehow discourses inside of the social media. The other posts were in fact nearly not commented or discussed critically or whatever. Yeah, this was in fact my little presentation, or the presentation of my results. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Lutz. You closed with this kind of example, which I saw some faces in the audience. It was quite interesting. So we are done with the presentations from the countries. We have, of course, a lot of presentations because we have other partners involved who are not able to join us today. I don't know if there is any question here or online. You can share your question in the dedicated chat.
Natalie?
Yes.
May I just add a comment just to reinforce some of the key findings of all these studies, or trying to trigger the discussion?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, let me do very quick, if I can share my screen again.
I think you are.
Yes.
You're allowed.
So just to, because I started saying, can you see the screen?
Yes. Yes.
The right one. Yeah, the right one, right? Yeah. The presentation mode. Just two main remarks. Okay. The first one is, when we were trying to analyze the the results at the EU level. Okay, so if you see the current diagram, what we try to develop is we have the analysis of migration plus Europe. So these two concepts through keywords, okay, to conduct the within country analysis and between country analysis. From all the presentations, you see clearly a narrative in each country, okay, an explanation in each country. When we try to elevate this at the EU level, we see the difficulties to do that, to find a common EU, let's say, European explanation. Okay, so I will put the example of transposing a directive or a regulation. We have a directive or a regulation, this is transposed, and then in each country, you may have found a different interpretation, okay? So this is the first reflection on how this analysis at country level, at EU level, can have like some lessons learned to intervene, okay? And the same reflection goes with the semantic map developed by the consortium. Okay, so we found that we have a way to interpret Europe across countries and to make this a story at a national level. If we want to escalate this story at EU level, okay, we have more difficulties. It is more difficult. Okay, so therefore it can be, I mean, it's always difficult, but while at a country level, you can find certain drivers to intervene in the discourse or in the narratives, we see the difficulties to intervene at EU level, because maybe in each country, the message or the intervention could be different based on the representations that we have identified, so to speak. I don't know if this helps or not to trigger the discussion. In any case, thank you.
Thank you, Paco. Any other reactions, questions? Even online, you can share your questions, or we can even give you the floor if you prefer to talk.
Paco, Andrea here. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
About what you were saying, you already know we'll have this discussion in Lisbon next week for the last deliverables we have to produce. You think that there is no way to come out with recommendations at the scale of the European social media discourse? You think it will have to be for each country?
No. There is, don't get me wrong. There is. The problem is the instruments we have. So, and that's why I was putting the example of a directive or a regulation, you know what I mean? So when they put in place a EU law, in some cases, this needs to be transposed into the countries, okay? And each country with the same values and philosophy transpose this into norms, okay? Into national norms. When I see this, and we can provide recommendation, I see that the semantic map we have developed is useful to conduct the analysis. Once we have the analysis and the results, they are easily we can interpret them in each country, okay? And we can find kind of a justification of these results. When we move at EU level, we see like, look, the action was the same, but the interpretation was different in each country. So the instruments, it may need to be different. You know what I mean? The territory mentioned in Portugal or the values mentioned in other countries. So imagine you are launching a campaign, okay? A media campaign to reinforce the idea of Europe and migration and the positive impact, okay? You may need to shape the message differently if you target Germany than Portugal, Spain, or Italy. You know what I mean? This is what I'm saying, that because the representation of migration in each country is different. If you want to target through a EU campaign the different countries, the message maybe is different because the representation or the impact that they may have is different. I'm not sure, because it's a complex topic and it's Friday, and sometimes I don't know if you get my point, Andrea. The recommendations could be provided, but yeah, we may need to think about what type of instruments can be used with different message in different countries depending on the findings. You know what I mean? So I'm quite sure. I don't know if you get my point. If I was able to explain myself.
Yes, thank you for making this point. I don't have an answer. I'll try to think this through in the next days, and it will be on the agenda of our discussion in Lisbon for sure. It's really part of the recommendation. So
how we can scale up the lessons learned to get one voice at the EU level, not the different narratives in each country. You know what I mean? But this is, I'm not, I don't know, maybe the colleagues from the international organization, they may have some ideas on how this can be done, because they are dealing with the same problem. It's an international organization based on national actions, so to speak. But I'm not sure.
Okay, we'll have this. Thank you. And as a man here, obviously I'm interested in all your presentations. I already do the work. I would have a question. Anna, please put the meeting for me. Okay. A question to Sofia and Antonio, because all in all, I'd say the results are very telling, not surprising. Well, many of these things we already knew. I was somehow surprised because, well, Portugal doesn't strike me as a country where migration and relation to the other is an issue. And it seems that in the last year, it has become an issue, and which is basically typical. We know before COVID, the immigration was the single most polarizing issue in the public debate, basically everywhere. It seems that something is happening in Portugal. Is that my impression, or it was like that? Thank you.
Yeah. So, as I was mentioning in my presentation, one of the big issues in Portugal right now is the housing crisis. So the cost of living, because of the inflation due to the war, is rising a lot. And one of the things that the prices of the houses in Lisbon right now are much higher than they were like 2 years ago. So obviously this becomes an issue when people are starting to understand that the government, especially when I'm talking about migration here in the case of housing, I'm not talking about the migration of refugees or people with low income. I'm talking about like the United States, people coming from, we had like a surge of people coming from the United States and other very developed countries, where young people come to Portugal, they work in Portugal, but they work from Portugal, but they work in international companies. So their salaries are much higher than the average salary in Portugal. And they can afford a lifestyle that most Portuguese people cannot. So a lot of people are mentioning issues with the housing being related, obviously, with their free income of this surge of these high qualified young people. So that's why in the context I mentioned the tax breaks that we have. So we have like a fixed tax break. I think it's between 13 or 15% for highly qualified migration. That people consider that is not fair. So this is becoming a discussion, not so much as I mentioned, for instance, in Germany regarding the Muslims, or for instance people having more children, and like we are not a cultural unit anymore. I think it's more about fairness, fiscal fairness, or about cost of living, and what means to have a population that has much more money than the normal Portuguese has living in Portugal. Yeah.
Also in Paco's presentation, there was this allusion which I liked very much about the possible connections with the Gini index, so the internal imbalances, which means that at some point, in some situation, immigrants are the easy ones to scapegoat when you are suffering from a situation, for instance, internal imbalances. This might change what we have to put on paper in terms of computation. Well, thank you for thinking this as well.
Volker?
Yes, thank you. I would like to come back to Paco's ideas about having to translate a European campaign into national narratives. I think that's very important in any case, but we have to consider when formulating our recommendations that the situation now is very different from the situation at the end of 21. So in the Belarusian crisis, we have seen that there was no European policy in place. Poland was essentially left alone and decided on its own policies, building walls and barbed wire things and so on. So now, I mean, it was clear. I think there is a general understanding in Europe that we cannot leave the migration problem with the frontier countries like Turkey, Greece, Italy, Portugal, where many of the migrants arrive originally, but it has to be a solution on the European level. And this is emerging now with the Pact on Asylum and Migration, which is about to be concluded. Let's hope it will be successful in the end, but that will change the situation completely. Now there will be a European policy in place, and I think the situation, if a similar situation occurs like in Belarus, I think there will be more. We will see more of a joint action on a European level rather than a unilateral national policy towards migration. And I think we have to take that into consideration when formulating our recommendations. Yes. Thank you.
Volker, just very quick, if may I, the situation has changed for sure, and is changing all the time. But what will not change is the semantic map. It will change the values of the different representations within this framework that we have built. So I think this is where we are strong. How we can capture this representation, the method that we have established is still valid. What will change is the values, you know what I mean, on the different dimensions, and therefore how we can use this as a tool to support the policymakers, for example, or to support the actions. So situation always changes. Theory, it may remain or until it is tested, so to speak.
Can I just add something regarding what Volker was saying? I do believe that this new pact will be helpful, but from Portuguese experience, when we try to, even if we welcome communities like a refugee community, if they don't have already ties to this country, they will not stay. So, for instance, in the case of Ukraine, because we have so many Ukrainians already here, we are receiving a lot of Ukrainians and they are staying. But our experience previous to this, especially regarding refugees, we had a huge program to welcome refugees. We were trying to take the pressure, for instance, from Germany. It was receiving much more than we were, or other countries, but they would come here, and after a while they would just leave and go to Germany again, or like to the other countries, because they did not have a community here. So even if at the institutional level we create this cooperation to spread out more the support that we are giving to the migrants, we cannot force them to stay in the countries that we allocate them to, right? So because of our free the way that we can freely go around the European countries once we are in. So I think the only maybe we have to think one step ahead. That is, besides having the allocation, then how can we make sure that they stay, not forcing them, but creating the spaces. For instance, regarding good job opportunities or other kind of situations to make them stay in the countries. Although obviously, if they don't have a community, it's always going to be hard.
We also have a question from Professor Yamina El-Kirat from Mohammed V University in Morocco. She's also the coordinator of the subnetwork of migration of UNIMED. So she's asking, I think it's better that Paco replies as the package coordinator, how we find out about, sorry, how did we select the social media included in the study?
It's very simple. We did whatever was feasible. So it was feasible to, at that time, to download as researchers the information from Facebook and Twitter. So we did whatever was feasible within the boundaries of the time and budget.
Thank you, Paco. Last call for questions. Oh yeah, anybody else wants to add something? Okay, so I thank you everybody, all our speakers online, our partners. The results, of course, of the research on the migration dimension are available on the website of the EUMEPLAT project. You can download and review to all the results and the best practices for all the partner countries of the project, along with the other results, for example, on the gender dimension. And we will have a conference next week in Lisbon on Monday and Tuesday on the other dimension of the research, so the gender dimension. We will start, I think, in a few moments with the second session. So thank you, everybody.